In this video, we're going to talk about sampling distributions. Before we start talking in depth about sampling distributions, there are two things that we need to define, and they're very similar, but they obviously are a little different. So first is a statistic. So that's a number that describes some characteristic of a sample population. And a parameter is a number that describes some characteristic of the population, so the whole group. So you can remember S and P as statistics come from samples and parameters come from populations. So one other way to think about it is here we've got X bar, which is the sample mean that estimates this mu or the population mean. And then P hat is the sample proportion, and that estimates P or the population proportion. And S sub X is the sample standard deviation, and that estimates our sigma or the population standard deviation. So now let's identify those things using an example. So let's identify the population, parameter, sample, and statistic in this setting. We're only going to do one, so apologies if you were excited for multiple. A Gallup poll asked 515 randomly selected U.S. adults if they believe in ghosts. Of the respondents, 160 of them said yes. So now let's identify the population, parameter, sample, and statistic. So the population is all United States adults. The parameter is the proportion of all U.S. adults who believe in ghosts. And the sample is the 515 people who were interviewed in this Gallup poll. And then our statistic, our P hat, or our sample proportion, is the proportion in the sample who believes in ghosts. So that's 160 out of the 515, and that is about 0.31 or 31%. So there are two more ideas that spring from this idea of sampling distributions, and the first is sampling variability, and that refers to the fact that different random samples of the same size from the same population produce different values for a statistic, which we would expect. The next is sampling distribution. So that of a statistic is the distribution of values taken by the statistic in all possible samples of the same size from the same population. So remember that a distribution describes the possible values of a variable and how often these values occur. So a sampling distribution shows the possible values of a statistic and how often those values occur. And of course, let's put those ideas into practice. So let's work through this example called reaching for chips. Not the chips you might be thinking of, or at least not the ones I was thinking of. So the problem says, to determine how much homework time students will get in class, Mrs. Lynn has a student select an SRS of 20 chips from a large bag. So think about like poker chips, or I guess potato chips, whatever you want, whatever. Float your visual boat. The number of red chips in the SRS determines the number of minutes in class students get to work on their homework. So the teacher claims that there are 200 chips in the bag and that 100 of them, so half of them, are red. When Jenna, a student, selected a random sample of 20 chips from the bag without looking, she got 7 red chips. So 7 out of those 20 were red. Does this provide convincing evidence that less than half of the chips in the bag are red? So there's going to be multiple parts to this. The first is, what is the evidence that less than half of the chips in the bag are red? One way to answer that question was that the student's sample proportion was 7 out of 20 were red, and that's 35%, which is less than half, or 0.5%. Now let's provide 2 explanations for the evidence that we just described. One possibility is that the teacher is telling the truth and Jenna just got a sample proportion less than half because of sampling variability, small sample size. It's also possible, though, that the teacher is not telling the truth and less than half the chips in the bag are red, as evidenced by the student Jenna taking 7 out of 20 red chips out of the bag, which is less than half. So the second part to this problem says that we use technology to simulate choosing 500 SRSs of size n equals 20, the same as that student, the number of chips they pulled out of the bag, from a population of 200 chips, 100 red and 100 blue, for example. So the dot plot over here shows a p hat, or a sample proportion of red chips for each of the 500 samples, because we chose 500 SRSs. So first up, there is one dot on the graph at 0.8. Explain what this value represents. So what that one dot means is that in one simulation of those n equals 20 chips, there were 20 times 0.8 or 16 out of the 20 red chips. So our p hat, or sample proportion value, is 0.8 for that sample. Next question said, would it be surprising to get a sample proportion of 7 out of 20 or 0.35 or smaller in an SRS of size 20 when the p equals 0.5? Let's justify our answer to that. So I look at 0.35 and lower here, and although it's not the bulk of the data, I would say no, it's not surprising because there are plenty of simulated p-values that exist at 0.35 or lower. And then last is, based on all of our previous answers, is there convincing evidence that less than half of the chips in the bag are red? One way to answer that is that from our last response, it's not surprising to get a p hat or sample proportion of red chips that are equal or less than 0.35. There's not really convincing evidence that less than half of the chips in the bag are red. Also, if you just look at this distribution here, the peak is at 0.5, which is what our teacher says is the proportion of red chips in the bag. So that distribution with an SRS of 500 or even more is not surprising because it would make a normal distribution size, at least, the more SRSs we chose. So essentially what you're doing when you take that SRS of 500 or something really large is that you are taking the information that we have, so we know that there's a 50% chance of pulling a red chip, or as we called it, a blue chip, or some other non-red colored chip, right? And that's the frequency here. So if you split that up into many different SRSs with the number of trials being 20 or the number of chips being pulled in this situation, you're going to get different results, right? So you could pull things where blue is more likely to occur, or you could have samples where red is more likely to occur. So if you take this information, you take all of these different distributions that can happen, and you repeat the process over and over and over, hopefully using technology to save you some time, you're going to get an approximate sampling distribution. So essentially what this is saying is that the idea of a sampling distribution is to take many samples from the same population, collect the value of that statistic from all of those samples, and display that distribution of the statistic in a dot plot or another type of graphical display. So our dot plot shows the approximate sampling distribution of the sample proportion of red chips. So there are three major takeaways from an example like this. One is that the population distribution gives the values of the variable for all individuals in the population. So in our case, the individuals are the 200 chips and the variable is the color, whether it's blue or red. And our parameter of interest is the proportion of red chips we get in the population where the probability of pulling one is 1/2 or 0.5. The second idea is that the distribution of sample data shows the values of the variable for the individuals in a sample. So the distribution of our data shows that the values of the variable color for the 20 chips in the sample. So did you get red? Did you get blue? For each sample, we record the value of the sample proportion, p hat, and that would be of the red chips. And then the third idea is that the sampling distribution of a sample proportion displays the values of our p hat, or a sample proportion, from all the possible samples in the sample size. So keep in mind that our sampling distribution describes how a statistic like our p hat, our sample proportion, how those vary among all the different samples in our population. And that differs a little bit from the population distribution and that distribution of sample data. That describes how individuals may vary in your data or in your samples of a larger population. So let's move on to describing sampling distributions. So these are distributions of data, and of course we can describe all sorts of things like center and variability and all that good stuff. So what we're really trying to do when describing these things is asking how trustworthy is a statistic as an estimate of a parameter. So when we talk about center, for example, we are talking about biased and unbiased estimators. So what is that? Well, a statistic of a sample used to estimate a parameter of an entire population is an unbiased estimator if the mean or average of its sampling distribution is equal to the value of the parameter being estimated. So in our red chips in the bag example, we have that the center of our distribution is very close to 0.5, which is the parameter value, right? The probability of pulling a red chip is 0.5. So our p hat is very, very close, and exactly p, in fact. Our p hat is very close and exactly p. So that would mean that our p hat, in this case, is an unbiased estimator. So really, what this is telling us is that the statistic of the sample will not consistently either overestimate or underestimate the parameter, which is what we want. So unbiased is better, at least in this example, than biased. We'll do more with this idea later in the chapter. Promise. Another thing we can describe is variability. And in terms of sampling distributions, the smaller the variability, the better. And so let's take a new example. Moving on from red chips, we're talking about the TV show Survivor. And let's say that the true proportion, or p-value, of US adults that have ever watched that show is 0.37 or 37%. So if you were to model a drawing of 400 SRSs where n, our sample size, is 100, you get this distribution. And so the variability is about, let's say, 0.22-ish to 0.5. So that is our variability. That is our range of our data. And our standard deviation is about 0.047. Now, if you ran that same number of SRSs, 400, but where your n value is 1,000, so going from 100 to 1,000, you end up with something like this as far as our sampling distribution. Now, our variability is much smaller, so we're going somewhere between 0.32 up to 0.43, maybe. And so our standard deviation drops from 0.047 to 0.016. So what that tells us is that larger random samples tend to produce estimates that are closer to the true population value. And like I said, the p-value, the true proportion rather, was 0.37. And this gets really, really close to that. This would model a normal distribution-ish shape with a larger sample size. So interestingly, the variability of a statistic does not depend very much on the size of the population, just as long as the sample size is less than 10% of the population size. So now let's take another look at this Survivor statistic. And let's say that in a small town of 25,000 people, 37% of that population has watched Survivor. So same p-value, 0.37. And then if we simulated that 400 SRSs of a size 1,000, so just like the sample proportion that we did on the second example there, if we simulate that same data and those same trials for this small town, you'll notice that our results are pretty identical to the sample proportion. So what ended up happening, this was the population with n equals 1,000 of the entire United States population, or adult population, and this is the population using the same n value and p value of a small town of 25,000 folks. You get the same distribution. So this may not surprise you, but this result essentially says that the size of the population has little influence on the behavior of the statistics from random samples. So it doesn't really matter which samples you take as long as it is random, or as random as it can be. And so the closer you get where your statistic of a sample matches a parameter or gets as close to a parameter should reveal that you can use that sample statistics, whatever they may be, to represent that larger population. Last thing we want to touch on in describing sampling distributions is something that we'll call choosing an estimator. So in a lot of cases, it's pretty obvious which statistic you should use as an estimator of a population parameter, right? So if we wanted the population's mean, or mu, we'd use the sample mean, or x bar. And if we wanted the population's proportion, or P, we'd use the sample proportion, P hat, right? So a lot of the times you know what you're looking for. In fact, you set off collecting data looking for specific statistics. But sometimes it is unclear what we should use. So some things to keep in mind when you are choosing an estimator for a statistic that will model for a parameter. So imagine for a moment that we are talking about a bullseye, and our goal in terms of choosing an estimator, what we should use to describe a sample in a population, is trying to fire our little arrows at the target. So in terms of thinking about how those little arrows would land, we need to first consider bias, so whether something has a high bias, a low bias, or no bias, and then the kind of variability, which we talked about in our previous slides there. So when you are thinking about something with a high bias, essentially what ends up happening is you do not shoot anywhere near your center, right? This has high bias and low variability, so that means that we're far away from center, but all of our data points are kind of clumped together. Low variability, but high bias, far away from center. And here we have a high bias, but also a high variability. So instead of being compact, they just kind of scatter, but you're still very far away from your center. So may I suggest not using an estimator with high bias at all. And in terms of low bias, we get something like this with high variability where we're close to the center, but all of our little arrows kind of hit around there. And then, of course, if we have no bias and low variability, we're going to hit smack dab in the center. So essentially, in other words, when we have estimators with high bias, our estimates are not accurate and they're not precise. And those two words mean slightly different things, but both are not good. So if possible, choose a parameter or a statistic that is going to give you the lowest bias possible and the lowest variability possible, because you don't want to waste your time analyzing all the distributions that exist. All right, and that's going to do it. We finally made it through this video. Thanks for watching.